Very good. Hi, welcome everyone. This is the live broadcast on 24th July 2023 for the EU Intellectual Property Competition 86 level. And my name is Andras Baneth, and we're recording it or we're broadcasting it from Brussels, which is rainy and quite chilly, unlike most of Europe. And I'm very pleased to have you here, though you might see this later as a recording, but those who are here at the live session are very welcome, and we appreciate that you spend your time, perhaps your lunch break, perhaps on vacation, perhaps during work, with us to discover more about the EPSO competition and about this wonderful opportunity to get a job by passing the selection competition and landing a secure position, a secure job in the wonderful city of Alicante at the EU Intellectual Property Office. So with that, I just want to make sure that we have clearance, that everything works as it should. And I'm looking at my screen, I'm looking at the camera, and I get that confirmation from my colleagues to make sure that everything is running smoothly. If you have any questions, as always, please put that into the chat box, and you can certainly try that by sharing where you are joining us from, as we always do. It's a customary exercise that we always do. So put in the chat box where you are dialing in from, where you're watching this from. That will give you some familiarity with the chat box and a fun information for me to see. I see some of you are from Brussels, from Athens, from Italy, and from all over Europe, perhaps even beyond. Alicante, wonderful. So with that, let's get started. We have a lot of ground to cover. And this is pretty much the second competition that EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office, has launched since they have reformed the selection procedures. What happens is they came up with a relatively new, somewhat changed model compared to how it was prior to 2023 summer, pretty much, prior to 2023 June. This is under the new regime, the new kind of selection process, which I'm going to walk you through. The most important aspect of which is that there is no more assessment center. So the selection purely happens on the basis of multiple choice tests and a case study, a written exam, but there is no presentation or interview or any other assessment center related exercise that you'll be required to undertake in order to pass and secure a place on the reserve list. So with that, a bit of housekeeping, a bit of check to make sure that we are all on the same page. Yes, I'll need your help because the slides don't seem to be advancing as they should. So I'm going to walk you through the sound check. I think is probably all good. And then in terms of, oh, there we go. Thank you so much. You can hear me hopefully speaking. You know my background. We're going to go to the next one. If we can advance, then just wanted to share with you that we're going to be sharing the recording with you. We're going to be sharing the presentation with you as a PDF, and then a transcript of everything that I'm going to share with you in the next hour or so. If you have any questions, whether you're at a live event, you have certainly the privilege to ask questions in the chat box. And if you are watching it as a recording, you can send us a message. We'll try our best to answer that through replying to you or following up. Whatever question I may not be able to answer or question that I may not have time to answer, we're going to come back and write a memo or some sort of a write-up to make sure that no question is unanswered. So with that, let's go to the next slide and see a little bit about our community, about EU training. We have a pretty robust community. Over the many years we've been in business, over 100,000 users, perhaps even more since then. A lot of Facebook followers in different groups. There's a dedicated Facebook group that you might want to check out if you're on Facebook for this particular competition. And then we have a pretty robust database of test questions and a database of practice tests and exercises, which have been used in all sorts of combinations that you can imagine. Over 70 million combinations and tests have been created or generated over the many years. So it's a pretty impressive number. With that, a lot of webinars. So check out the different webinars we have. Some are free, some are paid, which on our methodology, some are brushing up your math skills, a bit algebra skills, if that's not something that you've dealt with for some time. And we certainly have many other explanatory and methodology webinars that I hope will be of interest. And then in terms of the special exclusive offer, there is a discount code that I'll be sharing with you at the very end. So if you stay till the end, that's our little incentive to make sure that you follow everything. Now, let's take a look at the new selection process, a quick overview that I had promised to be on the same page and ensure that you are fully familiar with the way EPSO has changed or fine-tuned the selection process compared to a system many of you may know from the past. So the first one, you submit an application, right? Like that's pretty much the idea. You fill in all the forms and register on EPSO's website. You may have already an account, and then you submit the application with all the bells and whistles that it requires. Now, uploading supporting document actually is required, but there's a longer deadline for that. So typically that goes beyond the application deadline, but you do need to upload certain documents. We're going to look at those deadlines. But once you've done that, you will need to sit certain tests. That's pretty clear. Nothing has changed in that regard. What has changed is the composition, the way these tests are created, or the sequence or the timing, and some other seemingly minor but highly impactful details. Certainly I'm going to walk you through those, but to give you the heads up, computer-based exams or CBT tests are still very much part of the selection process. These are abstract, verbal, and numerical reasoning, so-called psychometric tests. They are part of the selection process. You have so-called field-related MCQ, multiple choice questions. Field-related means that in this particular competition, it's intellectual property, the knowledge base around intellectual property framed in a European Union setting. So whatever pertains to intellectual property, the way the European Union looks at, but even a little beyond that of what belongs to the body of knowledge around intellectual property law that is potentially part of the knowledge base that you'll be tested on. These are the kind of questions around which you can expect exam multiple choice quizzes to choose the right answer, the accurate, the correct answer out of most likely 4 options. And then you have the case study, which is referred to as a written exam because, interestingly enough, it does not cover intellectual property. What it tests is your skill, most notably your communication skill. So again, that is something we're going to come back to, but I already want to share that with you because a lot of candidates tend to think that this is an actual evaluation or assessment of their knowledge in that particular field in a written format, but it is not. It has a different purpose. So with that, these are the core parts. And then obviously EPSO, or more specifically the selection board, will need to check whether you truly qualify for this particular competition. So only for those who pass these hurdles, only for those who pass these specific components of the selection process will the eligibility be checked. That means you may have, or you will actually do certain declarations as to your professional background, your work experience, and any other required piece of information. And you need to upload the supporting documents. None of this will be checked manually, so to say, until you have passed the specific steps in the competition, because otherwise it wouldn't make much sense to spend a lot of time and manpower on the checks while certain candidates or a large number of candidates are going to be eliminated at certain part in the selection process. So with that, if everything goes good, and hopefully it will, and that's why we are here to assist you in that journey, there is a reserve list in the end, and your name is going to be placed on that reserve list, hopefully, and that is the prerequisite for you to be hired and recruited into a permanent position. The terminology is a little important here, I'd like to emphasize, because EPSO, as the name suggests, they deal with selection. They deal with the selection part of this process. They do not deal with recruitment, which is a whole other, legally and technically and practically speaking, a whole other part in the overall journey from your idea or desire to land an EU job all the way to you being hired as a permanent staff, in this case at the EU Intellectual Property Office in the Spanish city of Alicante. Selection requires these steps. Recruitment happens after the reserve list. So recruitment can only happen once your name appears on the reserve list, and there are certain steps where you can try to increase your chances. The possibility of you being invited into a specific position, into a specific vacancy that they are seeking to fill, and you need to be on the reserve list, but there's no full guarantee that those who are on the reserve list are going to be hired. So that is certainly an important point, and in all transparency, it needs to be said that this is an important and a required step, or a prerequisite, if you will, but it's insufficient yet, because you will need to be hired, you will need to probably sit a certain job interview or a certain conversation, perhaps some additional test, but then again, it's not yet known and it may not happen at all because it's entirely in the hands of the recruiting institution. So for the sake of today's conversation, for the sake of today's presentation, we're looking at the selection part. So with that, let's go on to the next slide and see what that actually entails and what happens. My clicker is probably not complying still. Let me give it a try. No, that wasn't me. And it's still not me. In any case, I think it's Rita in the back, and that's good enough. So with that, what are the positions that are available, or how many positions are available on the reserve list? That's an important aspect. There are 200 positions on the reserve list. And again, this is not to be confused with how many vacancies there are at the EU Intellectual Property Office. And that can also slightly change over time, because at the time when the reserve list comes out, they may have 50, 60, 80 vacancies. But down the line, 3 months, 6 months into it, or perhaps even a year into it, there could be more vacancies. They have the possibility to look at the reserve list, even a couple months in, and then invite you for a job interview and eventually land the job. But for the sake of today's presentation, there are 200 places on the reserve list, which is a pretty substantial number. That is considered a large competition, and that certainly gives you far more opportunity to succeed and be placed on the reserve list than many earlier competitions in similar areas. Where are you going to work? I already said that, and most of you are well aware that it's the job is in Alicante, and we just couldn't resist but to put that wonderful picture you just saw with the beach and the office overlooking the sea. I mean, that's pretty cool. And aside from the actual content of the work, which certainly is in and by itself a great motivating factor to deal with intellectual property on EU-wide level with further global impact that this entails, that's a pretty cool proposition. So with that, Alicante is the place of work, which maybe just one word I'd like to emphasize, which is quite unique in the sense that EPSO, as the Personnel Selection Office, when they announce and they run a competition, in most cases, that would typically be for one of the EU institutions, Commission, Parliament, Council, Court of Auditors, and others. And these institutions would be the clients, the typical clients, and the place of employment would typically be Brussels or Luxembourg. In this case, it's an EU agency, the EUIPO office, and the place of work is the seat of that particular agency. So this is a bit atypical. It's not very common that this kind of competition would be run on behalf of an EU agency, whereas, as I said, in most other cases, that would be for an EU institution, and the place of work would typically be Brussels and Luxembourg. So, having said that, is just to give you a full picture and give you a better idea of where this particular competition fits in a bigger picture. Okay, now it seems to have come to life. Very good. So that makes my life easier. What are you actually going to do? What does the job include? What are you going to do day to day? Aside from deleting emails, as we all do in our professional life, you're actually going to be dealing with intellectual property from its many facets and many angles. So there is a description of the duties, the typical duties that they are planning to offer you or require of you when you are hired, and that's listed in the Annex 2 of the Notice of Competition. By the way, that reminds me to give a word of disclaimer that I usually do at the beginning, but I seem to have forgotten that, which is whatever I tell you is not the official information. We do our best to give you the most accurate, most up-to-date, most contextualized information, but we are not EPSO. We are an independent company. So if you are ever in doubt of any discrepancy between what I say and what you may have heard or you may have seen elsewhere, make sure to check the Notice of Competition or even reach out to the selection board if that is allowed, or through EPSO's interface and ask their customer service or their contact center to give you information and point you to the official sources. So with that out of the way, let's get to the next part, which is a couple examples on what the typical duties are and what will be expected of you as an EUIPO officer. And examining, managing, preparing decisions for trademark and opposition cases or trademark opposition cases, design applications and invalidity cases, court cases related to intellectual property, and that's pretty much our set of examples. And that reminds me to mention that our very own little trademark that you see with the tree and our name and our motto, that's a protected trademark, thanks to the EUIPO office. So that's just as a side note, I was reminded of. Are you eligible? And that's our next big topic that I very much want to go into detail on, because eligibility is a vital part of the process, and it certainly determines whether or not you can actually proceed with sitting the test and proceed with going through the competition, or you may be disqualified at some point for lack of relevant experience or for the lack of the right qualification. So let's look at that. What are general requirements? General requirements are pretty much common to every EU career exam. These are always required of all candidates, one of them being having an EU citizenship. Another one is to have completed military service, if that is a compulsory thing in your country, or if you were exempted and you're not going to be called into the army even after you've been hired, you've been recruited. So be sure that this criteria is fulfilled one way or another, if that is a compulsory military service in the country of your citizenship. Meet the character requirements, so that relates to criminal record or other misdemeanors or other events in your past. I've never heard any candidate for whom this was an issue, but I can imagine that it may come up at one point, and they need to be sure that you have an impeccable ethical or social standing, and that will not cause any trouble for the future employment. Now, what's perhaps far more important for most candidates is looking at the specific requirements. So the idea there is, what are the concrete requirements in terms of qualification and work experience, and not just any work experience, but relevant work experience. So you need to look at carefully your background and your own professional path and see in which box or which category you would fit in, to make sure that you're not going to be disqualified at any point, even after you've passed all the different stages of the competition. So first, there is the language part, and then there's the qualification part. But let's look at the language part before anything else. And the language rules are a little, let's say, volatile in the new system, at least based on the extremely minimal sample of 2 competitions that we've seen so far. We saw one for economists a couple of weeks ago, and now we have the IP. Now here, for the IP competition, there is a concept of language 1 and language 2. That is kind of a legacy from the past, from previous competitions, from previous exams. So the concept is most likely not unheard of for most candidates, having a language 1 and language 2. How do they relate and what they are? So language 1 is basically any of the EU's 24 official languages. These are basically your EU mother tongue, the way I put it. And I emphasize the point EU mother tongue because if your mother tongue is Russian or your mother tongue is Vietnamese or any other, that certainly would not be an EU official language, but one of the 24. Just to note, Luxembourgish is not an EU official language, but Maltese and Gaelic are. So be sure that it's a language that is officially recognized as an EU official language, and that's what you pick. Entirely up to you, completely independent of your passport, of your country, of your citizenship. So me as a Hungarian citizen and I'm a Belgian citizen, but with 2 passports, but with that background, I could choose Hungarian, I could choose French, I could choose English, and I could choose Latvian, though that would not be a smart choice because I don't speak any Latvian. But you are entirely free to choose whichever language you please from those 24, completely irrespective of the country of your citizenship. Having said that, there's language 2, which first of all, it must be different from language 1. You cannot choose English twice. And language 2 must be one of 5 languages, and that's English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. These are the most common spoken languages among candidates in the institutions, in the EU, and also as a first and a second language. So this is to say that 99.9% of candidates will be able to pick one of these. So if you're a Czech citizen or Bulgarian, you could choose Czech or Bulgarian as language 1, and then you have perhaps English as language 2, entirely your choice depending on certain aspects and on certain considerations. What are these? Well, choosing a language 2 is advised, or certain consideration I'm encouraging you to contemplate is the language in which you're going to sit the multiple choice quiz. So the language in which you know the professional terminology linked to intellectual property, and that's going to be the language in which you need to draft the case study, the written exam. So again, depending on your knowledge, where you may have obtained your degree or in which language you learned the terminology linked to intellectual property, or in the case of the case study, a written exam, in which a language in which you are able to express yourself with the most eloquence or with the greatest vocabulary, and not to forget the spelling that you're comfortable spelling. So I'm pretty good in French, but my French spelling without spell check, it's a bit shaky. And for that reason, I would certainly go for English, but that's just me. So it really depends on your particular background or situation, or where you may have been educated, or in which language you have to obtain that professional knowledge, and knowing the jargon, the professional terms linked to intellectual property. So that should inform your language 2. And then language 1, it largely depends on your ability to process written information in a more passive way. Why? Because the abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning exams will be administered in language 1. So for verbal reasoning especially, you probably want to choose a language in which you can read fast, you can process the information pretty rapidly, so you can answer those tests with great efficiency. So with that, what are the qualifications? So you saw the specific criteria, there was the language part, and then there is the qualification part. Qualification can be a bit tricky because there's a lot of diversity, there are a lot of variables for most candidates as to what sort of degree they have, what sort of work experience do they have. And did you do a PhD? And did you teach during PhD? Did you do a summer job, or you are waiting tables in a restaurant? Does that qualify as work experience? So there are a lot of open questions, and EPSO itself provides a fair bit of information in the Notice of Competition proper and on their website in a bit of a Q&A and clarifying certain aspects of how you count the work experience or what happens with a compulsory internship, which was part of your education, and similar questions. Let's look at it. Essentially, there are three scenarios that they have outlined, and these are the three that I'm going to present to you. The first one is having 3-year university law diploma, right? Like you have a degree in law, and that determines the requirement for your work experience. Because if you have a diploma in law, then you need 3 years of work, of relevant professional experience. So 3 + 3, altogether a 6-year requirement of sorts. So degree in law, then you need 3 years of experience. But what happens when your degree is not in law? Your degree is in anything else. If you're a nuclear scientist, if you are a linguist, if you are a physicist, if you are 15th century French literature major, anything, as long as it's a recognized university diploma, in that case, you need 5 years of relevant work experience. So 3 non-law degree, 3-year non-law degree, then you need 5 years of relevant experience. And then comes scenario 3, which is kind of in between, where you have 3 years of diploma, 4 years of experience, but you have some extra qualification, a degree in intellectual property rights, right? So that's the case when you obtain an extra qualification in this particular domain that is highly applicable for the job profile that they are eventually seeking to fill. So I hope that's clear, and I'm sure there are quite a few questions, and from the corner of my eyes, I see that there are many questions coming in. So I'll get to a couple of the live questions in a second, but just to finish off this part. So professional experience is considered relevant if, and there are a couple of pointers here, as I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of variation among candidates, certainly a lot of very unique personal situations, whether you worked in Europe or outside Europe, or what is the recognition of a certain degree. Has it been homologated? I don't know if that's a word in English, but based on the French word, but has it been recognized by an accreditation body? There are many variables, but the professional experience itself is perhaps a bit easier to prove, because you can have a job description, you can make certain declarations, and you can find official documents as to the nature of your work experience. And if it was acquired in the field of intellectual property and directly related to at least 2 tasks, 2 duties that are listed in the Notice of Competition that is annexed to the Notice of Competition. So it's a bit of a fluid, it's a bit of an open thing, but not completely open-ended. There are very specific pointers as to the nature of the duties, and you need to match your professional experience to those particular tasks that are listed in the Notice of Competition. And before I get to why this is a great opportunity, let me quickly take my phone here with a couple of questions that Agi is feeding here. So for prior jobs, can we provide a letter from the company signed by the director indicating the tasks that were developed? I believe yes. So how else would you actually be able to prove that you did certain tasks and you did not do certain other tasks? So simply the name of the position or the company or law firm or organization or trademark office where you worked, that may be insufficient, because you could work in a trademark office in a assistant or secretary role, but just the other way around, you could work in a law firm that deals with criminal law, but you were actually the IP specialist. So certainly having a formal letter and declaration signed by the person in charge or the higher ups or the CEO or the manager or the head of the office in a letterhead and signed as an honest declaration, that is a pretty strong evidence. Is it possible to pass this competition even if the experience in IP is not that strong? I had a training on IP, but not worked a lot on IP files. In terms of passing the competition, yes, because you can learn stuff, you can pass the abstract for numerical reasoning, you can truly brush up your knowledge or improve your knowledge about IP matters from a host of sources and do practice tests. And we have tons of multiple choice specific questions on our website that you can practice with. Yes, in terms of passing, possible. Whether you meet the formal criteria, the formal qualification requirements and work experience requirements is another matter. So are you going to pass the eligibility test? Well, that depends a lot on your personal circumstances and on your background. And as long as that you can prove that and it matches the requirement, then you can be in. And again, you certainly are not going to make up information. You're not going to make up certain things. You want to be honest and make sure that everything that you declare is a true declaration, and that's how it happened. So make sure clarification and confirmation that there is sound and it's back. Okay, so wait a second. It's back. Good. Sound is back. We're happy. So for what is the best use your So for what is best to use your best language, CBT or MCQ? So I may have answered that already. So again, the CBT, so the computer-based test, the abstract for numerical reasoning, it's a somewhat passive exercise. So you need to choose a language in which you can read and process information the fastest. Language 2 should be a language in which you can understand the professional terminology, the jargon linked to IP, and you are able to draft a written exercise, a written test with the greatest sophistication. So that probably should inform you which language to choose. Certainly if you have the liberty or you have the luxury to choose from multiple languages that you are fluent in. All right, one more and then we go on, and I know there are a couple other questions. I'll try to come back to those. Is there a procedure to be transferred as an AD permanent official from an EU institution to the Intellectual Property Office? I'm not sure I can give you the official answer for that, because a lot depends on your status. What status would you hold? If you are a permanent EU official, say 86 EU official, theoretically, and as far as I can remember from the staff regulations, that should be possible to be seconded to an EU agency. So you can be a permanent EU staff and then be seconded to the EUIPO, subject to vacancies, subject to an approval from HR, subject to an actual job in which they think your profile would contribute the most. But I think legally speaking, that should be possible. And again, with the caveat that this needs to be double checked, but as far as I know, this should be possible. Okay, so moving on, why is this a great opportunity aside from the chance to walk on the beach to work barefoot in the sand and enjoy the wonderful weather in Alicante? But there are great benefits in terms of salary, in terms of allowances that you have access to, that you're given as an EU official. So certainly EU-European schools are available in which your children, if your children can learn in your first language, again, with as long as that's an EU official language, but they can get access to almost like a national education, health insurance, and pretty attractive salaries. What that actually means in practice We did a simulation. We have a salary calculator on our website, which we recently updated. And a shout out to Esther and Rita and Agi, who worked heavy and hard on that. So here's the rundown on what you might expect as an AD6 official in Alicante, with certain variables that we filled in just for the sake of the exercise, whether you have kids or no kids, or married or not married, and health insurance and other variables. But the monthly net salary is around 7,500 euros, which is a pretty good salary, especially when you compare that to the living costs in Alicante, because in other parts of Europe or other parts of the world, it may have a lot lower purchase power than it does over there. So that's a pretty attractive thing. So if you are not yet convinced, hopefully this will convince you, but I do encourage you, don't go only for salary, go for the love of the work, go for the professional development, go for the idea of working for the EU. And obviously the salary is a very important aspect, but as a friendly piece of advice, if I may, don't make that the only or the main motivation, because that just works for a while, but not in the long term. In any case, let's look at the different stages of the EPSO competitions. Let's look at what it has to offer, or what you need to pass, which stages to be placed on the reservist in the end. So, application process, I mentioned it briefly in my intro. You fill in all sorts of stuff, you answer tons of questions online, you make sure that you tick the right boxes, and you answer whatever question is asked of you. You can do that in any of the 24 official languages of the EU. So that's pretty cool, because that doesn't have any impact on the languages you choose for the actual competition. This is the application part. You upload supporting documents into the account, and you make sure that you apply before summer ends. So 29 August is the cutoff date. Do not leave that to the last moment. If you're planning to go hike in the mountains, or do whatever, go on the beach, or just visit your grandma in your hometown, no matter what, make sure that you don't forget about this, you don't leave it to the last moment, and you might want to do it already, and be sure that you have all the information that's needed, because certain documents may need to be requested, or you may need to do a bit of investigation and find out a certain certificate or degree, or it has to be translated, who knows. Make sure that you check everything in time, so you are not leaving any of these formal steps to the last moment. The point I mentioned earlier, that uploading the documents, the supporting document, can be done a bit later. And the deadline they give is the 2nd of October. So there's a bit more time to make sure that you get all those documents and upload them. But then again, be sure that you already check what's needed, and you can already take certain steps to make sure you get them on time. But there is a certain flexibility in the system. And then the tests. Probably that's the greatest concern for most candidates, and that is where, how do the Americans say, the rubber hits the road. I think that's the expression. And I'm getting a thumbs up from Jesse, who's himself American. So that's when the real performance is required, in the sense that you need to pass those specific elements. This is the specific stages in the competition. Interesting enough, this is done remotely, and this is done in a single sitting. So you're not going to be required to travel to Brussels or Luxembourg or Alicante, for that matter. You can do that from anywhere in the world, as long as you have the right equipment, and that's pretty much a computer with a webcam, and you have administrator rights to that computer. So corporate laptops, you want to check that with IT beforehand. And you want to make sure that you can sit in a space with reliable internet and silent, no external noise interrupting you, being sure that you can really focus. But all of this happens in a single sitting, and it's not going to take a particularly long time. So I'm not doing any quick mental calculations, but roughly 2 to 3 hours, perhaps even less. That's pretty much it. So to recap that, The computer-based tests, so the abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests, are in language 1, so any of the 24 languages, and the field-related, so the IB-related multiple choice questions are in language 2. And then you have the case study, which is also in language 2, and all of this is happening in an interface on your own device. So there's no test centers anymore, there's no traveling required anymore. It's happening all on your device with the remotely proctored, that's the term, so remotely supervised and remotely verified systems to make sure that there's no cheating and that there's no extra help that you may use, but it's fully your true performance. Now, to recap that, it's online, remotely proctored, and on the same day. So you have that already on the screen to visualize how this might look like. A word, maybe I can put a plug, a little commercial note, where we at the Ambiorix Center, where we're broadcasting this from, in Brussels, if you happen to be here, we have a studio which is fully compliant with all the requirements. So if ever you need that kind of silent space, reliable internet, and make sure that everything runs smoothly, then you're welcome here. Reach out for Ambiorix Center, and we can help you with that kind of logistical support that you might need for the exam. So with that, what about the computer-based test? What does it look like? I'm quickly going to run through because I'm assuming many candidates or most of you may have already seen those or may be familiar with those, but it's done in language 1. Important aspect is pass or fail. So there's no ranking for these tests. It's only pass or fail, and that is pretty helpful for most candidates. Now, what does it look like? It doesn't count to the final score, so it's not added to the final ranking. It's really just, did you pass, did you fail? And what are the different scoring formulas that you need to be aware of to optimize your performance? Verbal reasoning, 20 questions, 35 minutes, that's pretty classic. So also in the past, this is the kind of approach and formula that EPSO used. You have a text passage and you have different answer options. They try to mislead you, they try to confuse you, they try to make sure that it's not entirely obvious which one is the correct answer, but the idea is pretty much the same as it used to be. Verbal reasoning, it's reasoning more than language comprehension. You need to think and you need to apply logic to find the correct answer. Numerical reasoning, 10 questions, 20 minutes. Again, a pretty classic timeline. So you have 2 minutes per questions. The question, you have a chart, a table, you need to do certain arithmetics and reasoning, estimation, calculation, find the correct answer for that particular test. And then you have the abstract reasoning, which is often considered to be the toughest, because you have here 10 minutes and 10 questions. So a minute per question is quite short. The good news is, and we're going to look at that in a second, the good news is that the calculation, the way these are considered, the way these are taken into account, there's a formula for that. So for the verbal reasoning, you need to get half of the questions right, then you're happy, you pass that part. And then for the abstract and the numerical, they combine the score. So you need to have 10 out of 20 points for you to pass the abstract and the numerical part. So theoretically, you can completely mess up the abstract reasoning and then still pass if you get all the numerical reasoning right. You don't want to take that risk. You want to be sure that you maximize your chances, but this is a bit lighter approach. It's not that you need to pass each of these components by themselves, but the numerical and abstract are combined, and the pass mark is at halfway. So, what else? Yes, so when you are done with this test, they're not going to immediately evaluate the results. The results will be done algorithmically after the exam, but still only those who pass the abstract verbal numerical, so the CVT, will have their specific questions and the case study corrected. And that's saving some energy, some bandwidth, some resources. And this is an elimination test. It's a filtering test, hence that approach. Now, the field-related questions related to intellectual property, 35 minutes and 30 questions. which from our perspective is somewhat limited. So it's hard to truly evaluate your knowledge in the field, and it's perhaps a bit difficult to do ranking of candidates on 30 questions. Nevertheless, that's the approach. So the 30-question test is the rule of the game, and that's where you need to maximize your scores. Given the fact that you're going to be ranked on the basis of this particular test, you need to score really high. I cannot tell you what that score is, whether it's 22, 25, 27, but definitely it's going to be high, and certainly depends on the number of candidates, because you are going to be ranked on that basis, meaning how many candidates are there and how others perform. So how many others have participated and how the others have performed. That's where they're going to determine the cutoff line after the ranking. And then you have, well, this is the language 2, and then there's certainly there's a pass mark, but it's not that relevant in the sense that it's going to be ranked, and it's truly insufficient to reach only 50% of the points. You need to do far better than that. So from practical perspective, having a pass mark is not that relevant, because you are aiming to be among the top percentile of the candidates and not just pass. So that is the approach. And as I said, you must be among the highest scoring candidates. It will count towards your final score, but it's not the only component that counts towards your final score. There's another one, which is the case study, the written exam. What that is, duration, we don't yet know. And there I assume maybe EPSO or the selection board does not yet know either. So that is a bit being decided, being drafted, being finalized as we speak. Again, without any formal knowledge or any rumors that I've heard from that side of the town, but still, this is not yet communicated in the Notice of Competition or other sources. Chances are it's going to be relatively short, so maybe 45 minutes, not an hour and a half or not 2 hours, but our estimate or guesstimate is 45 minutes for the case study written exam. But the scoring, we know there's a scale of 10, and you need to pass 5 or reach at least 5 points. But then again, this counts towards the final score, similarly to the multiple choice quiz. There is another layer of complexity here. So it's not just simply adding up your scores in the multiple choice quiz and the case study, but there's a formula. So before we get there, I'm just running through these parts. I think I've covered the language part and what it does. Oh, by the way, before we get to the formula of the MCQ and the written test, just to emphasize the point, this is not linked to intellectual property. It may be the case, or the framing is around intellectual property, but the task that is required of you is not to write a briefing or not to share your knowledge on whatever convention regulates certain aspects of intellectual property or trademarks and designs. What happens is this evaluates your written communication skills, your crafting skills, based on a background document, based on certain components that you need to look at, and then turn that into some written assignment. So how do these two components come together, and what's the formula? This is the magic formula. So there is a certain weighing where the domain specific, the intellectual property multiple choice quiz, that counts 70%, and the computer-based test 30%. Sorry. I think there's actually a mistake there. It's not the CBT that's at 30%, it's the case study that it's at 30%. So what you have there is the multiple choice quiz. So the specific questions linked to intellectual property has a higher weight in the overall score and thereby the overall ranking. So that's 70%. And then the case study score is at 30%, but they multiply that by 3. So it's a bit odd, and we were, we raised our eyebrows a little bit, why that is the case. I'm guessing maybe because it's on a scale of 10, and that's relatively little as a scaling, but then they decided to multiply that by 3, but weigh it at 30% only. So it's a bit of a strange formula, at least not something that they had ever used earlier, but these two come together in a way where your actual knowledge in this particular field carries a much greater weight. With that eligibility check, what do you need to provide? Well, that's already going to be in the system, right? Like 2nd of October was the cutoff date for you to upload the supporting documents and prove your case that you are fully eligible for this particular competition. And only then will they actually check the content of those documents. So whatever you have declared is going to be checked at that point, and make sure that you are not going to be disqualified for one reason or another. And then they look at the score and say, who are the top 200 candidates, provided that they pass the eligibility check. So maybe they look at 250 because some candidates may not have proven their work experience that it's relevant, or they may not have been able to prove that they have the right qualification, though it's a very broad requirement, as we have seen. And yet there could be some who may fail at that point. Bottom line is that they want to fill up 200 places on the reserve list, and this is where they are going to look at. They are going to check the best performing candidates, so to say, with the weighing that I've just outlined. And then final point, how do you get the job? Well, you practice, right? Like you want to understand the process, and that's exactly what you're doing right now by watching this webinar. You want to practice depending on where your weak spots are. If you are not that good in abstract reasoning, focus on abstract reasoning. If you're not that good in, or you feel you need to brush up on your intellectual property knowledge, well, that's a pretty vast body of knowledge. We have over 100, perhaps even more, multiple choice tests to help you evaluate your existing knowledge. But certainly you can look at things like the IP Office annual report. You can look at stuff as EU legislative summaries. You just Google that, EU legislative summaries. You find things related to the internal market, and more specifically to IP, trademarks, and design. There are quite a few resources out there that you can use to make sure that you focus on each aspect of the competition. And depending on how you perform in these tests, you want to dedicate certain time to it on a regular basis, whether it's hours, daily, or a couple of times a week, up to you. But have a certain plan in place and make sure that you're fully prepared. And I'm anticipating a question, though it might be already somewhere in the list down there. When do we expect the tests or the actual exam to take place? Well, there's certainly going to be a time frame for that, given the fact that all candidates have to book a date where they sit in front of their computer in a protected space and they need to take the tests. So that's going to take some time until the contractor who's in charge of that on behalf of EPSO or the selection board, they coordinate all of that with thousands of candidates, presumably. So my guess is that maybe from mid-October until mid-November, late November is the likely time frame, with the caveat that this is not an official information. It's purely based on the timeline and guessing how the logistics might play out. With the perspective in mind that EPSO wants to speed up the process. The whole, the reason behind this particular system and removing the assessment center from the process was to make create a more efficient and rapid process from start to finish being publication of the reserve list. Being persistent and then doing the simulations, it's a general piece of advice, but very important, just like for any sports preparation. Measure your performance and see where you need to focus on. So with that, use our resources, use the practice tests, use the webinars, use all these resources we put out there, and lots of them are free, others are paid. We're here to help, we're here to support you in the journey. Let us know in what way we can help. There's the EU textbook, the Administrator's 2023 edition. I can already tell you that there's a new edition coming up in probably January 2024 with even more changes and updated content. but for the moment, the 2023 edition is the official one. Well, official as in my official, or the one that we recently published. And then we're working on yet another one in 6 months. And then there is a Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, you can share information, rumors, or best practices or ideas with fellow candidates. And then I leave the discount code on screen while I look at a couple of other questions that I still have not answered. Though I can see that Agi in the back end has removed a couple of questions, assuming because I covered them in my presentation. So here's one that is still there, which is the following. How do you understand the work experience requirements listed in the Notice of Competition? Does one have to have 5 years of professional experience in 2 of the relevant duties each? How to present work experience in order to be eligible? Well, the way the Notice of Competition puts that forward is that you need to have that relevant experience in at least 2 fields that are listed in the annex. So you certainly are not required to cover everything that they listed there, because that probably would not be possible unless you spent the last 30 years dealing with intellectual property in the EU. So it's not that you need to tick all those boxes, but certain, at least 2 duty descriptions need to be covered by your work experience at the minimum to be eligible. And then if there are other variables there, let us know, we'll give you our review, but the official final say is from the selection board if you are in doubt whether certain experience qualifies as such or it does not. I actually don't see any other questions, and correct me if I'm wrong, from the corner of my eyes, I can see somebody says the code for discount is not working. Anyways, my colleagues are gonna look into it right away, and if there's any glitch, then just wait 2 minutes and you are going to make it work. And I hope that this helps. I hope that this gets you a little closer to your goal of landing a job in Alicante, landing a job in EU intellectual property law, and all the related fields, because it's a wonderful opportunity, especially those who have been dealing with this field for some time. And there's an amazing community down there, a couple of good friends who live and work there. So certainly recommend that. And let us know how we can help or what information you might need. A big thanks to everyone who made today's webinar possible, to Jesse, to Rita, to Agi, to Esther, to everyone out there, and my colleague Jofi, who's now on holiday. But with that, thanks for being here. Tell us if we can be helpful in any way, or point you to the right resources or the right information. Feel free to share this webinar if you have colleagues or friends who are interested in this. Feel free, and wishing you good luck, mucha suerte, wherever life takes you, and hopefully that destination will be Spain and Alicante, the EU Intellectual Property Office. So with that, have a nice holiday if we're going on one, and to be continued with other exams. There are many more competitions coming up in the coming few weeks and months, so we'll make sure to cover those, and we're also going to be releasing tons of new resources and new practice material on EU training, so stay tuned and watch out for those. So thanks for being here. Have a good day.